At the time of this video's creation, Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation in Ukraine has raged for nearly 2.5 years. It's an operation that was meant to be completed in weeks, with the storming of Kyiv resulting in the glorious raising of Russia's flag as Putin claimed a former Soviet territory. That isn't what happened. Instead, Ukraine fought back the initial Russian advance before finding itself allied with practically every Western nation, receiving consistent military aid that's allowed it to bog down Russia in a war of attrition. Putin didn't expect this. Russia didn't expect it either. Today, Putin faces the very real prospect that he will lose a war that he believed he would win easily. But even beyond that, Russia stands to lose even if it's successful in Ukraine. How could that be possible? To explain, we must first consider the situation that Russia finds itself in as it continues to fight in Ukraine, and what that situation means for Russia as a geopolitical entity regardless of the outcome. First, let's look at the practical aspects of the current war and how Russia is edging closer to losing it. That may not be apparent at first glance. Despite being confronted at every turn, Russia has made territorial gains in Ukraine. It's taken much of the Donbas region, including the important city of Donetsk, and it also controls Mariupol and Melitopol. As we speak, Russia is launching offensives in the Kharkiv region as it hopes to slowly push the war's front lines closer to Kyiv. Yet, it is in this Kharkiv fighting that we start to see the first glimmers of a Russian loss. As Al Jazeera reported toward the end of June 2024, Russia and Ukraine have found their forces stalemated in that region, with Putin's approach to the battles being the same as he's taken before: throw as many of his soldiers at the fight as he can, in hopes that he can overwhelm Ukraine. Russia even lost ground in its latest incursion, allowing Ukraine to recapture portions of Vovchansk, as well as the Taik settlement. Yuri Pravka, a Ukrainian colonel, noted in June that Ukraine had pinned down dozens of Russian soldiers in Vovchansk and was in a position to continue pushing Russia back. Still, is this really such a big deal? After all, the war has seen similar ebbs and flows throughout, and if there's one thing that has always remained true, it's that Russia just keeps pushing. The question now is, can Russia continue the slow burn of the war? That's looking increasingly unlikely for several reasons, starting with Ukraine's consistent receipt of Western aid. In April, the US Congress approved the delivery of a further $61 billion in military aid to Ukraine, which adds to the many billions it's also received from its European allies. However, June 13th brought even better news for Ukraine. It signed several long-term security agreements with powerful nations at the G7 summit. Specifically, it has a decade-long agreement with a new ally in Japan, which has already committed to delivering $4.5 billion in military, financial, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine in the second half of 2024 alone. As for the other 10-year agreement, it was signed with the United States. Details aren't currently available, but the headline here is that the US is committed to supporting Ukraine for at least a decade. There is even a word that NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is considering making it compulsory for all NATO members to deliver aid to Ukraine, ensuring the aid remains reliable and large-scale. Other aid is coming in the form of loans, with the G7 summit also providing the opportunity for the US to offer a $50 billion loan secured by the interest being earned on over $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. All of this points to a war that's going to be dragged out even longer, and the longer the conflict goes on, the less likely a Russian victory will become. Desperation is creeping into the Russian approach, which is demonstrated by Putin's attempt to form his own alliances. Nowhere is that more evident than in the June 2024 signing of a defensive pact between Russia and North Korea. Writing for The Guardian, Johns Hopkins University historian Sergei Radchenko points out that such a pact is a sure sign of desperation in Putin. With Russia's vaunted military machine having been proved something of a paper tiger by the Ukrainians, there is an implied humiliation in shopping around for weapons in places like North Korea, a disdained client state at the best of times. Putin finds himself seeking solace in the arms of another geopolitical pariah, with that move likely to lead to more sanctions being placed against both states. Radchenko also notes the North Korean pact will likely damage Russia's relationship with South Korea, a country he claims is a reluctant sanctioning nation and something of a weak link in the united front much of the West has taken against Putin. The message here is that Russia is actively damaging its long-term future by making a deal with the geopolitical devil. Through a collective defense pact with North Korea, Putin showcases his desperation as he looks for somebody, anybody, with which to align as he continues his special military operation. He landed on a geopolitical pariah to help him confront a Ukraine that is not only securing long-term Western support, but is also now gaining support from countries like Japan. Why has Putin become so desperate? The pact with North Korea hints at another problem that could cause Putin to lose the war in Ukraine. Russia is running out of equipment. Putin himself said as much in June 2023 when speaking to a collective of pro-war bloggers in the Kremlin. These bloggers have proven essential to Russia's propaganda machine, yet Putin seemed comfortable in telling them that Russia has experienced shortages throughout the war. During the course of the special military operation, it's become clear that there are shortages of many things: precision-guided munitions, communications equipment, aircraft, drones, and so on. We have them, but unfortunately, we don't have enough of them. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, or Minfin, demonstrates why Russia is in this position. It claims that Russia has lost a staggering 8,123 tanks, 14,712 artillery systems, and 15,583 armored vehicles between the war's beginning and July 3, 2024. Ukraine has also destroyed 28 Russian ships, a submarine, and 360 of Russia's planes. Of course, Minfin's figures may be tinged with bias as they come directly from Ukraine, but even if they're exaggerated, the fact is that Russia has expended a lot of its stockpiles due to being dragged into a war of attrition. Putin's own admission that Russia is struggling to keep its troops supplied spurred the ramping up of manufacturing in Russia. But even with that, the Russian army isn't getting what it needs. In February 2023, the BBC quoted several Western officials who claim that Russia faces extreme challenges in not only sourcing military equipment, but also getting the materials it needs to build more. One of those officials highlighted the impact of sanctions on Russia. Sanctions are hitting the Russian military-industrial complex hard, causing severe delays and increasing costs. An inability to access Western components is undermining Russia's production of new systems and repairs of old systems, with long-term consequences for the quality of weapons produced. The same official claims that Russia is now requisitioning equipment that was intended for delivery to other countries, meaning it's damaging relationships with its buyers in order to keep itself stocked. The situation is so bad that Russia may only have a one-year reserve of weapons available as of April 2024. That's according to David Axe, a journalist, filmmaker, and Forbes contributor, who points out that Russia is losing between 800 and 1,000 people daily in Ukraine. According to Axe, Ukraine is on track to kill 300,000 Russian soldiers by the end of 2024, which could potentially cripple the Kremlin's efforts to mobilize more soldiers during the year. Axe also notes that Russia's production, even in its ramped-up state, isn't sustainable. He says the country is producing between 500 and 600 new tanks annually, but is losing close to 1,000, more if Minfin's figures are accurate, per year. The gap between production and losses is so large that Russia has been forced to resort to using mothballed Soviet-era equipment to keep its troops supplied. No matter which way you look at it, Russia faces a severe equipment problem. It's fighting against a resurgent Ukraine that's receiving more military aid, as well as promises of aid to come, at a time when its own stockpiles are running low. The reliance on previously mothballed equipment can only last for so long, before that well runs dry as well, and the alliance with North Korea only offers a temporary salve to the situation. If Russia is to win, it needs to find more reliable sources of military equipment. Perhaps China is the answer. Often seen as an ally to Russia, partially thanks to both countries being involved in the BRICS economic group and sharing similar anti-West rhetoric, China seems like a natural ally to Putin. There are also plenty of claims that China is covertly assisting Russia in its war against Ukraine, with some of the most recent claims coming from a July 2024 report in Bloomberg. That report claims that China and Russian companies are working in tandem to develop attack drones similar to the Iranian drones Russia is already using in Ukraine. Still, it's telling that Putin signed a cooperative defense pact with North Korea rather than China. The reason is that Russia has never really been able to rely on China for support. Part of the reason for this is that mistrust has always been the driving force in the relationship between China and Russia. The China Power Division of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, highlights this. Though CSIS notes that Russia and China have indeed strengthened their relationship since the beginning of the Ukraine war, there is a growing power asymmetry between the two. China is a nation on the rise, and one that's rapidly modernizing its military, at a time when Russia is relying on Soviet-era technology to fight its war. Worse yet for China, an increasingly aggressive Russia creates the possibility of an international blowback against Beijing, which is something that China doesn't want as it seeks to walk the line between Russian support and Western trade. That has already almost been the case. In December 2023, US President Joe Biden signed an executive order that threatened sanctions against any financial institutions that enabled Russia to bypass the sanctions placed against it. That was essentially a warning shot to China: stop enabling Russia or Beijing will be the next target. In June 2024, a similar warning was delivered to China's small banks, this time with the backing of the entire G7. The result has been that many of China's banks have simply stopped trading with Russia, leaving Moscow increasingly isolated and perhaps explaining why he sought an alliance with North Korea ahead of the far more powerful China. Beijing is simply not ready to throw in with Russia. That's a severe problem for Russia, as China's influence is already massive in the country. As The Conversation pointed out in July 2024, the Chinese yuan accounts for 54% of trades conducted on Russia's stock market, with China also covering around 90% of the imports of electronic components, sensors, and radars that Russia uses to build advanced military hardware. If Russia is isolated from this Chinese supply, as is becoming increasingly likely due to the threat of sanctions, its material and equipment issues will be expounded. Russia will be capable of producing less at a time when it's already not producing enough to support its military. So Putin is left to form alliances and purchase weapons from North Korea and Iran, countries that are also subject to damaging sanctions. As for China, it's gained so much influence in Russia at a time when it still needs Western markets to support its economy. The Conversation suggests that China is now in a position where it could end the war without ever getting involved. All it needs to do is further cut Russia off economically by refusing to do business with it. So we see that Russia losing the Ukraine war isn't the only example of a conflict that it's on the verge of losing. Moscow is also losing on the wider geopolitical scale. Getting bogged down against Ukraine has allowed other countries to exert a stronger influence over them. China is the obvious beneficiary here, but North Korea is also now in a stronger position thanks to being allied with Russia. As for Putin and Russia, they're slowly giving up long-term power in exchange for short-term gains, which means that even a victory in Ukraine will mean it's lost geopolitical wars elsewhere. Russia only has one outright ally, and it's a country that is as isolated as they are. Russia's economic ties to China also led to a secondary war that Putin was losing, the war to maintain his country's economic strength. According to the Wilson Center, Putin legitimized his power base in Russia during the early 2000s by positioning himself as the leader who led Russia out of economic turmoil. Under Putin, Russia escaped the chaos of the 1990s and established itself as a country that achieved continued growth and stability throughout the 2000s and 2010s. That record and the goodwill that came from it is now in tatters. The Wilson Center notes that the Ukraine invasion led to many Western corporations leaving Russia, often selling their assets in fire sales to get out as quickly as possible. Modernity is on the downslide, with Russian manufacturing reverting to poor quality products. Cars are being built without airbags or anti-lock brakes. Western-made planes, both military and commercial, are failing due to lack of parts. Worse yet for Putin, it's the Russian people who are feeling the effects of the Ukraine war the most, as the Wilson Center explains. Russian counter-sanctions on such imports as food have driven up costs for Russian consumers, while Russia's national bank struggles to mitigate the elevated interest rates and plummeting exchange rates resulting from Russian wartime fiscal policies. The Wilson Center also notes that Putin's approach to the war has backfired economically. It says that many of the complaints he directed toward the West prior to his special military operation focused on how he believed other countries were trying to weaken Russia by turning it into a resource colony. That theory has become a reality, though it's not the West that's benefiting from Russia's abundant oil and gas. It's countries like China and India. Both are major buyers of oil from Russia, with both also often paying in the Indian rupee or the Chinese yuan, both unconvertible currencies for Russia in its current state. Even in the face of trade between Russia and China surpassing $240 billion for the first time in 2023, there were clear signs of an imbalance. Russia imports far more from China than China imports from Russia. In essence, Russia has become the resource colony Putin feared it would be as a result of the war. Only the beneficiaries are countries Russia might consider allies. That relegation to resource colony and the power imbalance that comes with it was made clear by China's President Xi Jinping during the 2023 China-US Summit in San Francisco. Reporting on the event, William Pomerantz, the director of the Kennan Institute, noted, "Xi proclaimed that the world was big enough for two powers. He made no mention of a third." If the US and China are those two powers, Russia has been relegated to a country that is useful for little more than the resources it can provide in the eyes of both. Even if we look beyond how Russia's war has downgraded it as a global power in the eyes of its contemporaries, Putin's approach to Ukraine threatens to leave Russia in economic ruin once the war ends. Win or lose, Russia still loses. Renaud Foucault, who's a senior economics lecturer at the UK's Lancaster University, says that Russia's economy has become so wrapped up in the Ukraine war that it stands to lose massively regardless of the outcome. That may seem like a strange claim, given that the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, grew by 5.5% in the third quarter of 2023 when compared to the same period in 2022. But that supposed growth masks the fact that the Kremlin's goal of spending $386 billion on its war machine in 2024 is the key, as Foucault highlights. Military pay, ammunition, tanks, planes, and compensation for dead and wounded soldiers all contribute to GDP figures. Put simply, the war against Ukraine is now the main driver of Russia's economic growth. Combine this with a massive labor shortage, with suggestions that the country is short around 5 million workers, and there's a grim picture being painted of Russia's economic future. Inflation is rife, Russia doesn't have enough workers, and even if it wins the Ukraine war, it'll still have to find at least $486 billion to rebuild. That rebuilding would come amidst constant rebellion from Ukrainian separatists, along with the likely continuation of sanctions. Should Russia lose, it'll be in the same situation. Ukraine and the West will look to it to fund the rebuilding of Ukraine, with the end of the war ending the country's main economic driver. This leads us to another way that Russia will lose its war. The Ukraine war is creating rebellion within the Russian Federation. We saw that in the early days of the war, as hundreds of thousands of Russians chose to emigrate to other countries rather than risk being conscripted into the Russian army. The Economist puts the figure at between 817,000 and 922,000 in August 2023, meaning that it's likely broken 1 million since then. One of those thousands was Yevgeny Kozgorov, a 38-year-old father who left Russia with his wife and child in June 2022. Now living in Tbilisi, Georgia, itself a target of Russian aggression in the past, he has come to see his homeland as a force for evil in the world. "I understand perfectly well the general hatred for Russians and for everything Russian," he said when speaking to Al Jazeera in January 2024. "I accept and understand it because what Russia is doing is wrong. Every time I want to say that it's difficult for the Russians who left, something inside me protests because Ukrainians have it more difficult than us." Granted, Kozgorov's voice is part of the minority. Russia is a country of 144 million, so some may argue that losing 1 million leaves 143 million who do support the war. However, the support at home is waning, as highlighted by the Atlantic Council. It refers to a Levada poll conducted in November 2023, which found that 73% of Russians still support Putin's special military operation. However, the number who offer firm and unquestioned support has fallen from 53% in March 22 to 39% in November 23. Much of that decline in support comes as a result of Russia's younger demographics. The Atlantic Council notes that only 5% of Russians who are 25 or younger consider state TV as an objective source of news. Returning to the war support figures, the resource also notes that just 30% of those below the age of 25 support the war unconditionally, contrasted to 56% of people aged 65 or over. While it would be inaccurate to claim that Putin has lost the war at home for support, there's a definite trend toward younger generations no longer buying what he's attempting to sell. It also shouldn't escape notice that the people who are most skeptical of Putin's war are also the people who are most likely to be conscripted into it. Perhaps a generational war is coming. There's a large enough contingent of Russians who have either left the country or are at least skeptical of Putin's ambitions to suggest that his claim to power may weaken in the coming years. That could happen regardless of whether Russia wins or loses against Ukraine, another no-win situation that Putin has to handle. The situation gets worse when you cast light on Russian territories outside the mainland. In March 2024, the chess grandmaster and co-founder of the Free Russia Forum, Garry Kasparov, spoke on what might happen to the Russian Federation should it lose the Ukraine war. Now living in self-exile, like the million-plus others who have left Russia since the war broke out, Kasparov claimed that Russia's current borders may not remain if Ukraine wins. He points out the likes of Dagestan, Chechnya, Tatarstan, and Bashkortostan as likely candidates for territories that may seek independence from Russian rule. Linking the possibility back to Russia's economy, Kasparov claims, at the end of the day, economic factors will play a major role in that matter, but it's very important today not to support the position of a united and indivisible Russia. Russia appears anything but united, even if the dissolution of the country is unlikely in Kasparov's eyes. Plus, the territories that he mentions are far from the only ones that may seek independence. There are others, and they have attempted to make their voices heard. In February 2024, the online voting for the national referendum on self-determination of national republics ended. That referendum was unofficial, and Russia may claim it was even illegal. But it is notable because it essentially asked the residents of 5 Russia-owned territories whether they wished to be independent of the Russian Federation. All said they wanted independence. Kaliningrad, also known as Königsberg, voted for independence with a majority of 72.1%. The Urals weren't far behind with 68.2%, while Ingria and Siberia achieved results of 66.2% and 63.9% in favor of independence as well. Even Kuban, the most divided of the 5 territories, came out in favor of independence, with a vote of 55.7% in favor versus 44.3% against. Again, you could argue an element of bias in these results, as those who desire independence were the people most likely to vote in an unofficial referendum. Nevertheless, the results offer more evidence that Russia's grasp on its own territories is starting to slip during a time when it's trying to expand. Combine this slippage with the very real possibility that it will lose in Ukraine due to its enemy receiving so much Western support, and it's clear that Russia is on the verge of losing a war on multiple fronts. In addition to losing the tangible war with Ukraine, or at best is being fought to a stalemate in a war it expected to win quickly, Russia will also lose an economic war as its war machine grinds to close amidst the country welcoming more influence from China and North Korea. That influence means that Russia is also losing a geopolitical war, with many seeing it as a far less powerful nation than it was before the special military operation. And even internally, Russia is becoming more divided, as younger people and many of those living in its outer territories increasingly voice their disillusion with Putin's approach. And there's more. Russia must also have one eye pointed toward the future. In April 2024, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski made a speech to the Sejm, the lower house of Poland's national legislature, in which he claimed that any war with Russia waged against NATO would end in Moscow's inevitable defeat. It is not we, the West, who should fear a clash with Putin, but the other way around, Sikorski claimed. It is worth reminding about this, not to increase the sense of threat in the Russians because NATO is a defensive pact, but to show that an attack by Russia on any of the members of the alliance would end in its inevitable defeat. It's difficult to argue against that. Sikorski notes that NATO members collectively have 3 times the military personnel, 3 times the aerial resources, and navies that combined have 4 times the ships. Those ships are also more powerful. America's Navy alone displaces 4.5 million tons of water, compared to just 1.2 million for Russia's Navy. Add to that the depletion and equipment issues Russia is currently facing due to the Ukraine war, and you get a weakened state that would likely crumble in a war against NATO. That's a war that Putin and his officials have threatened on several occasions, most recently after the US allowed Ukraine to start using its weapons to attack Russian territory near the Kyiv border. The problem for Putin is that the Ukraine war has revealed Russia's army to be something of a paper tiger. It looks strong on paper, but is far less so in practice. That's the opinion of Timothy Snyder, a historian and the author of several books, including On Tyranny. Writing for CNN in May 2024, he says that the notion of an invincible Red Army is propaganda, and it has been well before the Ukraine war. As Snyder notes, Russia was defeated by Poland in 1920, likely only defeated Nazi Germany during World War II due to Allied involvement, and was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan, having failed to achieve its goals following its 1979 invasion. Russia's track record in the 20th century is not that of a nation that is a leading military power. The failing invasion of Ukraine only further demonstrates that on paper, power doesn't translate into automatic victory. So where does all of this leave Russia? There's a very high chance that it will lose against Ukraine, not only because Ukraine is receiving so much support, but because its own equipment stockpiles are dwindling. Russia is in desperation mode, to the point where it's seeking help from another geopolitical pariah, North Korea, a step that will only further isolate Russia from the rest of the world regardless of the war's outcome. China, potentially its strongest ally, is holding it at arm's length due to the threat of Western sanctions, and is essentially turning Russia into the resource colony Putin always feared the West would make it. Worse yet, Russia's economy is only being propped up by its war, and its people are showing signs of turning against Putin. Plus, regardless of the outcome of the Ukraine war, Russia is far from ready to fight against NATO or the many countries it counts as members. Even if Russia takes Ukraine, it's already lost multiple wars. It's lost economically, geopolitically, and in terms of the global view of its strength as a military nation. Taking Ukraine won't help. It'll still be a geopolitical pariah, with the only solution seeming to be to withdraw from a war that threatens to last for many more years. But what do you think? Do you believe that Russia will win in Ukraine? And if it does, will it manage to win the many wider external and internal wars it faces? Or are we watching as a major power continues a slow decline that will leave it a shell of its former self in the years after the war's end? Share your opinions in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.